If you're into model trains or a similar hobby, these are the top 5 power tools that I recommend and I think are the most useful to own. Now I'm going to show you the tools that I have, but I really strongly recommend you actually buy them from a local shop around where you live, because I think with any power tool, a really important part of it is how it feels in your hands when you use it. If the weight balance is wrong to where it's going to tire out your arm or your hand or something like that, after a while you might get fatigued and then you may be more likely to have an injury. So now let's look at my top 5 power tools. So number 1 is a cordless drill. This you're going to use so much for, obviously for drilling, for using to drive screws, that kind of thing. Having a cordless one is so much easier than having a cord, because sometimes you just don't have a handy power outlet, and so I always recommend getting a cordless version of a lot of these tools if you can, unless you have a permanent shop set up to where you don't really have to worry about power availability, where you're working and that kind of thing. Definitely a cordless drill, certainly super, super handy. It's going to get used a lot. Now a bonus tool that's very similar is to get a driver. So what I typically do is I have whatever screw I'm using, I have something to drive it here in the driver, and then I have my drill for whatever size hole I need to drill for the screw I'm trying to put in or whatever it might be. And this is kind of more of a luxury to have both, just because it makes everything go a lot faster. You can drill a hole, put in the screw, drill a hole, put in the screw, and you're not changing out bits. And that, if you're doing a lot of projects or a big project, this will save you a lot of time to have both, but obviously you don't need to. You could just use one and switch out the bits. And that's what I did for a long time as well. But having two really does make the work go a lot faster. Now, number 2, I'm going to go with a Dremel tool. And these are not in any particular order in terms of most to least useful, but a Dremel gets used a lot if you're into model trains, if you're cutting track and things like that. It's super, super handy to have one of these. And this one's a cordless one. I used to have a corded one. I think I still have it actually. But the cordless one, again, is just really nice, because if I'm working somewhere on a layout and I don't have an outlet nearby, then I'm trying to find an extension cord, and that's just kind of a pain. And so having a cordless one really does, again, just make it a little bit easier to do a lot of the projects I end up doing in terms of the different types of cutting. But especially for track, if you're cutting track, having a Dremel is super, super handy. Now, staying along those lines is a soldering iron. Now, this might not be what you're thinking of as a power tool, but it uses power, so I'm calling it a power tool. Now I have 2 soldering irons. I have this Hakko one, which works really well for a lot of wiring. I also have this Weller one. This is kind of more of an old school one where you pull the trigger, and then only when you pull the trigger does the tip get hot. But this is a very high wattage one, and so it gets hot in a hurry, and it puts out a ton of heat really fast. Now you can completely melt, like liquefy your Kato track or something like that with one of these. But having one of those can be very helpful in some scenarios. Sometimes having that higher wattage though can be safer for some electronics, just because you can make that solder connection in like an instant instead of having to wait like 10 seconds for everything to melt and get hot enough. And so you're not actually spreading heat around for as long a period of time. So it kind of depends what you're doing. Obviously, if you're doing like O scale, where you have much heavier gauge track, having a higher wattage iron, if you're trying to solder track together, can certainly be a big help. But I have both. Most of the time I use the Hakko one for doing wiring and things like that. But occasionally I have to bring out the big gun for something where I have to do a heavier gauge wire or something like that. Okay, now back to more of the motorized power tools is a cordless circular saw, as I dump sawdust all over my leg. Circular saws are super handy for cutting wood for building bench work, and you could do it by hand with a handsaw. Again, if you're only doing a project every now and again, that works fine. If you do a lot of projects or you have a huge project, circular saw is certainly very, very helpful. I also have a DeWalt compound miter saw, and that is actually super helpful for doing all the cuts of dimensional lumber, anything besides plywood, because I can get exact, precise cuts with that, and that is super handy as well. So you don't need that. That's more of a luxury, but if you're trying to cut a lot of things precisely, having something like that, which is fixed in place, and you're not kind of guiding by hand, does make your cuts a lot more accurate, and it's just a lot faster as well. So again, it kind of depends the level and the frequency and amount of cutting that you're doing. But certainly having a circular saw is the first one to go to. And then if you have a need, go for something like this compound miter saw that you see here. Now, a third sort of bonus one in the cutting is to have a jigsaw. Again, this one is a battery-powered one. I don't use jigsaws a lot, but if you're doing bench work where you're trying to cut out a curved piece, this is obviously super, super handy to have in those kinds of situations. Maybe you're doing kind of like a cookie cutter type bench work for the track, and you need to cut, all these like curvy shapes. Having something like this can be a huge help for those types of scenarios. Okay, my last of the power tools I recommend is an Orbital Sander. Again, dropping sawdust here. I used to have a corded one, and that worked fine, but again, the main issue was that a lot of times I like to sand outside in the driveway instead of in the garage, just because obviously there's a lot of sawdust mess, and usually it's windy here anyway, so it all kind of blows away into the lawn. And so it just makes it a lot more convenient to have the project in the driveway rather than in the garage. However, that requires pulling out the extension cord and everything else. And so I eventually got a cordless orbital sander, and this has been really nice to use. Now, the one problem with this one is that the battery is on the side. And while it doesn't really impact really much how you hold it or the feel very much, it does impact the weight distribution a lot. And so it's very heavy to the side. And so you're using a lot of strain on your wrist to kind of hold it, flat or whatever. And so it wants to go this way because of the weight. And so that does present some problems. You have to obviously, watch what's going on, because you might have a tendency to kind of start tilting your hand instead of keeping it flat. And when you're sanding like a large flat surface where you may end up getting one side of your sandpaper kind of digging in a little bit more. That's the only cordless tool I have in which the corded one kind of works better for me, just because of the weight issue of having that battery on there. But again, it's still very nice to have, and I actually use it still more than my corded one, just because I like to be able to go outside in the driveway and not have to pull out an extension cord. It's not a big deal, but it's just one more of those little annoyances when you're trying to get a lot done really fast. But anyway, if you're looking for some last minute Christmas ideas, these are some tools to maybe take a look at if you don't have them. Again, I showed you DeWalt, but there's all kinds of similar products out there in terms of quality and everything. And again, I highly recommend going to one of your local stores where you can actually, try it out in your hand, all the tools that you might want to buy. Maybe you have a big hand and the opening in the tool isn't big enough for your hand. That's just not going to work well for you long term. So, just try to find those things out first before you actually buy the tool. Anyway, just some ideas if you're looking for those last minute holiday gifts. But that's all for now, and thanks for watching. Bye.